The sport of MMA is certainly rife with chaos. It's not very rare in the sport that fighters nearly come to blows backstage, press conferences, and hallways, weigh-ins, on the set of TV shows, and it's no wonder given their profession.
Take care of your underwears. I'm gonna you, man.
But because of the financial consequences and the suspensions, it's rare that it actually happens. So that's what we'll look into today. Those crazy, insane instances where hell breaks loose and consequences be damned. We'll not just show you the footage, but also give you the backstory. I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and this is called the 15 craziest MMA street fights caught on video. Side note, we won't be looking to sparring or training brawls. Those are much more common. We're focusing on the more crazy and chaotic instances. Also, there are a ton of urban legends not caught on tape that we may do a list on in the future, so as the title indicates, this will only cover the ones captured on video. Number 15, Michael Chiesa versus Kevin Lee. So this first one is a bit more hilarious than the other entries, and it's just kind of stupid, but fairly notorious at this point, so it's gotta be in here, right? It all happened during the UFC's big summer announcement plans in 2017 alongside a bunch of pay-per-view headliners and other main events from TV fight cards. Kevin Lee, being the troll that he is, came out and talked a bunch of crap, to which a guy like Chiesa, who had an unusually short temper that day, was just not having any of. In the moment, Lee made a pretty innocuous statement about Chiesa's mother. Chiesa went off the handle.
But I just hope he shows up, because I know his mama got tickets, so...
Shut the f*** up about, hey, don't talk about my mom for one. Don't you ever talk about my mom.
Yeah, what's good?
Whoa. Just like that, Lee landed a punch and the two were broken up before it turned into an all-out brawl. Fast forward to their bout at Fight Night 112, it was pretty good, but ended with controversy as Mario Yamasaki,
I never want to see him reffing ever again,
who was the referee for their bout, ended up calling it before Chiesa had a chance to tap out to a rear naked choke. It looked like Chiesa was on the verge of tapping out anyway, but it still sucked to see it go down that way. But it's like cutting off a movie right before the best bit happens. Number 14, Joe Lauzon versus Dan Lauzon. Minus an exhibition grappling match here and there, you rarely hear about famous brothers in MMA actually fighting. One near exception was Frank Shamrock versus Ken Shamrock, but of course that never ended up happening. So that's what makes Joe Lauzon versus Dan Lauzon such a standout. Dan, the younger brother of the two, is much lesser known, but had also fought in the UFC in the past. This one took place before either of them had actually made it to the UFC. According to Joe Lauzon himself, as he told on the PKA podcast, Danny got drunk at a party and essentially became belligerent and a problem to other folks at the party. So the two fought in the middle of the party in their front lawn to settle the dispute. They ended up going 2 rounds, which was treated like 2 separate fights, with the older brother Joe easily winning each time and submitting Dan in both rounds. Number 13, Don Frye versus Sonny Westbrook. So who the hell is Sonny Westbrook, right? Well, it all starts with that weird mullet asshole Dog the Bounty Hunter. Dog's son, Leland Champion, who actually dabbled in boxing and MMA, was supposed to fight on a card in 2007 that had the guarantee of paying the fighters even if the card was canceled. Sure enough, the fight card was canceled and nobody got paid. So everybody was super pissed off, and it's unclear how the beef started, but evidently it's not a good idea to have a bunch of angry fighters around each other when they're all crazy mad and ready to fight. Somehow Don Frye, who was 41 at the time, got into it with Leland Champion's friend and boxing trainer, who was also a regular on Dog the Bounty Hunter's show, and they got into it and started exchanging blows. Sadly, Don gets the worst of it and gets knocked down in the scuffle. He immediately wanted to attack Sonny again, but cooler heads prevailed, and that was the end of it. It's a bummer to see a legend get decked like this by some reality TV star, but it's still too crazy not to show. Number 12, Josh Neer versus an internet troll. It's been a while since we've seen Josh in the octagon, and it appears his career is likely over since he hasn't fought since January 2016. But he did manage to beat some solid names back then like Den Thomas, Mac Danzig, and Dwayne Ludwig. This fight took place between him and essentially who was an internet troll at the time. The guy's name is Patrick Martin. And after the two had met up in person randomly at a bar, Martin apparently didn't like their interaction and began harassing Josh Neer online. He sent him all kinds of messages challenging him to a fight, saying he'd win easily, and after repeated attempts, Josh finally got fed up with him enough to actually accept, and here's what happened. Damn. And if you listen closely, you can actually hear his head hitting the ground after these elbows. This is vicious stuff. The crazier part is that Martin is actually 6'6" and weighs in at about 270 according to Josh. Josh, on the other hand, is a welterweight, which is about 170 pounds. Sure, he walks around with more than that before cutting weight, but there's still at least 70 pounds or so that's different between the two of them. Either way, it's interesting to note that Martin began fighting MMA shortly after this and is now fighting at heavyweight. At the time of this recording, he's on a 3-fight win streak, with his last being at the King of the Cage, and his next will be at LFA 34. So all this means we actually might be seeing this guy sooner than later if he keeps it up on a bigger promotion, which makes Josh's beatdown that much more impressive. Number 11, Marlon Sims versus Noah Thomas. So there's been a lot of scuffles or near fights that have gone down on the Ultimate Fighter, but few have actually gone to exchanging blows. Usually people are clear-headed enough to realize that their career is on the line if they do something and simply just break it up, try to grapple, or prevent more fist fighting with a submission or something like that. In this case, everyone was apparently too drunk to even care. It was season 5 with BJ Penn versus Jens Pulver as the coaches, and guys like Nate Diaz, Gray Maynard, Andy Wang, and Joe Lozon. Marlon got super drunk and started joking around. Noah took it seriously, and Marlon started escalating things by making fun of Noah's losses. Noah then started saying he would win if they fought, and just like that, they actually were fighting. Marlon clearly was the one getting the best of it, landing a few good shots, and Noah started it up again. Then they stopped, and then Marlon got pissed and started attacking him, and then by the end of it, he was slamming Noah's head on the concrete. Obviously, the two got kicked off immediately after when Dana White found out about it, along with the guy who acted as the quote-unquote referee. Number 10, Tank Abbott versus Scott Ferozzo. There was a very short period in the early days of the UFC where some of the biggest stars in the sport had just left, and a couple of wild brawlers got through. Because of their brash personalities and brawling styles that, despite either not having a really great record, managed to become fan favorites. Tank Abbott, for instance, fought Maurice Smith for the UFC Heavyweight Championship in 1997 despite having only a 6-5 record. Of course, he would end up losing and having a 6-6 record after that. Scott Ferozzo was in the same category, a brash, brawling type with no real technique or ability. And he didn't have a lot on his record, retired after just 1 year with a 4-2 record overall, after getting smashed by Vitor Belfort in his debut at UFC 12. But during that time, these two managed to fight. It was certainly an awful one at UFC 11 where, barely winning a slow-paced decision, Scott dropped out of the tournament because of his exhaustion. Since then, Tank Abbott had stuck around in fighting, and in between even landed a pro wrestling gig with the WCW during their heyday. He went back to the UFC unsuccessfully after that, and then he got knocked out by Kimbo Slice in Elite XC, and let's just say he's been through some phases since then. And for whatever reason decided to fight Scott Ferozzo in a backyard brawl. It was kind of fun at first, I guess, with the two exchanging hands on the feet pretty heavily, but for the next 15 minutes or so, Abbott pretty much just gassed out on top of Scott Ferozzo, who was also gassed, and no official winner was really declared.
That's what it's all about right here.
No, it's not. Number 9, Vanderlei Silva versus Chael Sonnen. If you're not familiar with Chael Sonnen, he's been known to talk a lot of shit. Not just about his opponents, but also their friends and where they're from.
Do you really believe that Minotauro thought that a bus was a horse?
That happened.
It was honestly pretty great TV, and he was a legit fighter back then. But after he lost to Anderson Silva a second time, he just wasn't the same. In the midst of all this, he talked about Brazil and the fighters that Silva trained with, and Vanderlei Silva, the Pride legend and UFC veteran who also happened to train with those guys, was really pissed at Chael for making fun of them and took major offense at the Brazil stuff. So the two obviously found themselves at odds with one another. So much so that the UFC actually gave them their own show on The Ultimate Fighter Season 3. From day one, Vanderlei was extremely hostile and seemed on edge, ready to fight at any moment. Chael, of course, played the troll character well and never appeared to show any real animosity, and got a real kick out of pissing Vanderlei off. So guess where that went? While waiting for the official weigh-ins to begin for one of the bouts on the show, it proved to be just too much time to wait as the two got to exchanging words. And this was the first real fight on the show between coaches, despite it getting insanely close between others in the past. And this even had one of the assistant coaches also attacking Chael in the midst of the scuffle. A whole host of things happened in between that prevented the fight from taking place in a sanctioned bout for the UFC. They ended up being kicked out because of PED issues and a bunch of controversy, so 4 years years later at the first Bellator event in New York, the two finally squared off in a fairly lackluster bout where Chael was able to earn a decision win. Number 8, Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier. This is one of the most notorious rivalries in the entire sport's history, and the controversy with Jones that surrounds it. But at the time of the brawl taking place, they hadn't fought yet, and it wasn't really well known how deep the rivalry actually went. It was also the first of many failed bookings where they were scheduled to headline UFC 178. Also notable is that Jones was actually supposed to rematch Gustafsson from their epic fight at UFC 178, but that also fell through. So this was actually a replacement that didn't end up working out. They ended up fighting at UFC 182. Injuries suck. But before all that, while at a promotional event, the two faced off and things flew off the handle. Cormier was the first to escalate things by giving Jon Jones a push, to which Jones responded. Before or since, there's never been a press conference quite as chaotic in the UFC. And as if this wasn't enough, the two still had press obligations throughout the day that led to these famous behind-the-scenes moments being published and used to promote their first fight at UFC 182.
Hey, are you still there?
Number 7, Charles Bennett versus Cristiano Marcelo. This backstage brawl is legendary. It goes back to the Pride days where pretty much anything went. Knees and kicks to the head on the ground, no test for steroids, and backstage brawls. Charles Bennett lives up to his nickname of being called Crazy Horse for his pre- and post-fight antics, as well as his numerous, and I mean numerous, arrests. Basically, the dude can't stay out of trouble. For some reason, being 5'7" and whose biggest weight class was lightweight or 155 pounds, with a mixed record, found it necessary to call out Vanderlei Silva and his team Shootbox while backstage at Pride Shockwave 2005. This was when Vanderlei was the Pride middleweight king, so of course it was a bit odd to pick a fight with him during this time. Of course, Vanderlei had a fight that night against Ricardo Arona where he would avenge his loss, but you can tell in the backstage monitor Dan Henderson had just won, so if you actually look at the fight card, Vanderlei was preparing to fight in a matter of minutes. Cristiano Marcelo took it upon himself to jump in and challenge Bennett. The fight goes down as you see here. At multiple points, Bennett tries to get free, but the triangle choke is simply too tight, and he goes to sleep. One of the Shootbox guys was kind enough to make sure he was okay, and you can actually see the disappointment on his face appear as he realizes what happened. The two have made up since, but of course there is more, as Bennett claims he actually knocked out Vanderlei Silva after coming back too from being choked out, and those two have no shortage of hate for each other that continues to this day. Number 6, Phoenix Jones. And there's a lot to unpack here, but Phoenix Jones is the quote-unquote real-life superhero alter ego of the mixed martial artist Benjamin John Francis Fodor. Fedor? No. Fodor. Whether it's a case of life imitating art like the movie Kick-Ass or not, Fodor and a group of others who self-titled themselves as real-life superheroes called the Rain City Superhero Movement, who would roam the streets and break up crimes and hunt down criminals. Fodor, or Phoenix Jones himself, has been stabbed and has had his nose broken while at gunpoint and has been identified as a costume vigilante by police, where he's even been arrested. Now it's really starting to sound like the comic books and movies. What Phoenix Jones has perhaps gained the most notoriety for, however, has been through breaking up fights, tracking down flashers and attempted rapists, and even fighting perpetrators himself on the street. And the fight that definitely comes to mind is the time he fought a big drunk redneck in Seattle who was causing trouble and starting fights on the street. It's actually pretty interesting because Washington considers itself a mutual combat state, meaning it's actually not illegal to fight as long as both participants are willing.
The suspect.
So even though it was in front of a cop, it was totally fine. And since 2014, Phoenix Jones has stopped fighting crime, but did finally go pro in 2013 in MMA despite being an amateur since 2006. He fought for the Super Fight League and the World Series of Fighting since then, but hasn't really done that well in MMA with a mixed record in recent years. Number 5, Jorge Masvidal's street fights. As you can imagine, after the fame of Kimbo's viral street fight videos, many others jumped into the fray hoping to gain a similar level of exposure. Kimbo even had a stable of prospects who would do that very thing. Jorge Masvidal, who in 2017 was actually just one fight away from fighting Tyron Woodley for the welterweight strap, and began his career all the way back in 2003, also found himself in the underground fight scene. The fight he is most known for was the one against Kimbo's biggest protege, who simply went by the name Ray, who's a much larger and bigger fighter that just knocked out another large foe. Feeling jacked and ready to fight again immediately, he just walked out and called for his next opponent, the unknown and much smaller Jorge Masvidal to fight. Sure enough, Jorge had lived up to his nickname of Game Bread, where he dominated Ray for most of their fight until Ray basically couldn't continue out of exhaustion. So they ended up fighting again to make sure the upset wasn't a fluke. This time Ray was a little bit better prepared and even scored a knockdown. But as the fight drew on, Ray's exhaustion took over again, and ultimately Masvidal was able to get the win when Ray verbally quit. Number 4, the Nashville Brawl. Alright, a quick heads up before we get into anything else. The UFC put a copyright claim on this part of the video when we tried uploading it last night because of the Strikeforce Brawl. So rather than risking our entire channel being taken down because of this one video, we're just going to have to show you guys pictures, and we apologize. There's nothing we can really do about it. Of all the brawls in MMA history, this is probably the most famous one. It took place on April 17, 2010 at the event called Strikeforce Nashville, and was headlined by then middleweights Jake Shields and Dan Henderson, which was actually a great fight and would prove to be the defining performance of Shields' career. And it all happened after nearly being knocked out in the first. It was so good in fact that during the post-fight speech, Jason Miller ran into the ring unprovoked and hopped on the mic demanding a rematch. This was during a time where the Scrap Pack, comprised of Jake Shields, Gilbert Melendez, Nate Diaz, and Nick Diaz, was at its most formidable. They pretty much ruled Strikeforce, holding belts at lightweight, welterweight, and middleweight. So when Jason Miller jumped into the ring, the Scrap Pack, who is no stranger to past scuffles, was all too ready to retaliate. When you get a chance to see this video for yourself, you'll see pretty much two people doing all the attacking. There's a part here where you'll see Nate Diaz doing a bunch of kicking on Jason, and then you'll see Nick punching the crap out of him. Basically, one-sided beating. Everyone is going after Jason Miller because he went in there alone. Unsurprisingly, this was the last time Strikeforce was broadcast on national American television with CBS before the UFC bought them the following year. Number 3, Khabib versus the Diaz brothers. It also took place before Nate Diaz would shake up the world against Conor McGregor, and even before he fought Michael Johnson. Diaz was of course already popular though, and the hype around Khabib was beginning to rise very quickly. Naturally, the two being in the same division, the two had already been trading barbs on social media, and so when they just happened to be at the same event at World Series of Fighting 22 in Las Vegas, the two began mouthing off. You can see in the first video, Nick Diaz is shoving somebody and throwing water at one of them, and then a couple moments later, Khabib's group ends up retaliating and physically attacking somebody in Diaz's camp. Fairly tame on that first video, but the next set of videos actually shows what happens when they go outside of the arena, which really takes it to another level. It's total chaos as melees begin to break out in every direction. Chairs are thrown, people are dragged and being kicked. I swear the police and security were afraid to intervene, and I don't blame them. Number 2, Kimbo Slice. So this one's addition should be pretty obvious, the most infamous on the list by far. And I really don't want to pick just one win here because they're all impressive. The closest one was against the Big Cop, and it was kind of a controversial finish, but they're all fascinating to watch, and as crude as it all is, it's impossible to look away. It's fascinating to watch. Since then, Kimbo fought in the most watched televised event at the time on Elite XC against James Thompson. He was on the most popular season, The Ultimate Fighter, by far, and helped, for better or worse, build Bellator during the beginning of the Scott Coker era. Unfortunately, he did end up passing away in 2016, and has been regarded well by the fight community for his character despite his rough past. But it's safe to say, as far as street fighters go, and street fights of MMA fighters in particular, it doesn't get any more infamous than this. Number 1, Roger Huerta versus Rashad Bobino. So how could this one be rated higher than any other on the list? Perhaps because it's the best version of street justice, instant karma, and a piece of getting the hell beat out of him. Rashad Bobino was a former linebacker for the NFL's Atlanta Falcons. It was a piece of shit. Oh yeah, I already said that. Well, f*** him. In this video shot by TMZ in 2010, you can clearly see Bobino sucker punch and KO a woman from behind. Enter former UFC star Roger Huerta. Apparently he picked one of the worst nights possible to do something so f***ed up because Roger approached him immediately shouting that he just hit a girl. You can't hear it on camera, but what Huerta said is that Bobino reportedly shouted back, "F*** you, I'll knock out any bitch I want." So immediately Roger went after him and the chase ensued. Unfortunately, you don't see what happens next from the cell phone camera, but when they do come back into view, Bobino is completely unconscious on the ground. I know it's a bit anticlimactic to see this as number 1 when you don't actually see the knockout, but considering how much the beatdown was deserved, it's hard not to see it as the best ass whooping on this list. It was a fun list to make, but this is what real MMA is about: self-defense and the defense of others, and saving the rest for inside the octagon and elite competition. Hey, what is up, everybody? I hope you enjoyed that video. This one was really long. It was about 20 minutes, so I hope that wasn't too long. For me, it was a bit rough because it was basically like editing 2 videos, so I don't know that 15 numbered list will be the norm moving forward. I don't know, maybe you guys really like that, but that meant basically I got 1 video done where I would have 2 videos done, so there is that to think about. But in case you guys aren't aware, so we rescheduled Luke Thomas to come on the podcast tomorrow. I was having some embarrassing audio issues with my Mac, so if you want to hear a little bit more about that, of course, we'll end up talking about that at some point tomorrow on the podcast. But that will be at 8 a.m. my time or 9 a.m. Eastern time here in the U.S. And then, of course, the big one is Boss Rootin', which will be next week, the 22nd. And so both of these are live. So if you guys want to join in, you guys can actually ask questions, all that sort of stuff live while we're right here on YouTube. So keep an eye out for that stuff. Can't wait for all that. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe as always, and we will see you at the next video.